Alright, as we get closer and closer to concluding this shit show, let's talk about episode 5 of the Santa Clauses, which opens with where that little cliffhanger was at the end of episode 4, where somebody grabs Scott by the shoulder, and that person, I kind of assumed it was going to be Cal Penn. Turns out it was Bernard. They actually did bring David Krumholtz back, finally. And I will say that all the things I've said about the show up to this point, there seems to be one thing that they have more or less fixed that really bothered me about the previous entries, and that is it's always been a problem that Bernard was one character in the first movie and then seemed to be a totally different one in the rest. And so he was much more slapsticky and weirdly animated, and I love that we more or less seem to have come back around to the more passive-aggressive Bernard, which is great. And I mean, I don't know how I feel about the joke that he's married to Vanessa Redgrave now, but it's so out of left field, I think I appreciate it. So, I'm good with that. So, it is really nice to see Krumholtz back in this part again, even if it's in this series still. But talking about going back to the previous movie, the very first movie, we're now going back to the other Santa Clauses of the past, where we learn a couple of things. Number one, we kind of get to officially meet the Santa that fell off of Scott's roof, where he became Santa himself. But also, this whole idea that that was the first time that had ever happened. Like, it was like basically an experiment, and Scott was the first human Santa and went through that whole clause process. Which is fine, I guess. I don't really know. It doesn't really feel like it has much of a purpose, like, apart from being a big reveal. There's not really much that it changes about what we've seen prior. The one thing that I do feel like kind of changes perspective a little bit is there's the flashback of Scott as a child when he first met that Santa, and they do a good enough job explaining away why he wouldn't remember that interaction. But what I kind of liked about seeing the child version of Scott is that while it doesn't really reflect Scott as an adult in pretty much every other aspect, it does feel like it sort of sheds some light on Scott's insistence that Charlie always believe in Santa in the first movie. How he was, like, super adamant about that and kind of keeping that in there. That kind of seemed, like, out of Scott's character otherwise. But I think when my brother did a video on the first movie a few years ago, I talked about the possibility that it was Scott's fear of Charlie growing up is why he kept pushing the Santa thing onto him. Which some of this stuff does negate certain things. Like, another thing we talked about was a question that everybody kind of had, which was, why did nobody miss the previous Santa when Scott showed up to the North Pole? Like, everybody was just like, oh, it's you now, and they didn't really mourn Santa or anything. And I guess they're explaining that away with he was never really dead. It was just kind of a set-up scenario to make Scott Santa. I don't really know. But not... I don't... Like I said, we're just doing this to fill in the blanks. It's mid-March. Nobody cares about this series at this point. Nobody's gonna even hear this, so so I don't know. I feel free to say I just don't fucking know. I really don't. But we talked about the idea of my theory on that was that the other Santa was like a tyrant or something, and that's why all the elves are super bitter when Scott got there in the first movie. It was like everybody was aggressive, like everybody had Bernard's personality. They were just really aggressive and sarcastic and all that. And it's like, oh, that was probably the other Santa's fault, so they're probably indifferent to seeing him gone. But now that that's not the case, I don't know, that other scenario is just even more confusing now. I think they probably thought they were like, oh, here we're answering all the questions everybody had about the first movie, thinking that was super clever, but now I just have more questions, I think. So there's that. there's in true fashion of this show, there's jokes that are run into the ground, like the name of the episode is Across the Yule-Verse, and so there's like a large fraction of the dialogue in this episode is the jokes about what are they calling this sort of Santa universe, and everybody has their own one. Um, I like the son's idea of Clausmopolis. I actually thought was a pretty good one, but that was one that got shut down the most. So it's clear that this, just no, just all of this sucks basically. Um, and we do get another scene that I feel like we've had way too many times before already. It's maybe only been a couple, but a couple is enough. The fact that when we're in this universe with this setup, one scenario that's going to continuously come up is having to try to explain to somebody out of the loop that Scott and the family, like, Scott is Santa Claus and they are the family and they're from the North Pole and all that. And so this girl, Riley, that the son has been seeing when we fast-forwarded through a lot of months, so we have no attachment to whatsoever, but now we come to the point where he has to explain to her this, and of course she's going to think he's really weird, think he's out of his mind, think he's playing games or whatever, and he's going to have to try to convince her, and we just really don't need this scene anymore. And that I think that when he tried to explain it to Elizabeth Mitchell in the second movie, and then obviously things play out the way they did, that's the only time we really need that scene. But because, like I said, this could have just been one TV movie instead of a 6-episode series, we gotta drag it out somehow, so that's how they're gonna do it. So, there's that. As far as Calpen's character and where he's coming from, now that he's basically the villain of the story, yeah, he's got this real sympathetic backstory where it's like, oh, his wife was dying, and while his wife was dying, he promised that he would make their daughter's life really easy and great and all that. So that's basically why he's doing this. That's why he wants to do... I don't know. They keep playing that up, that that's why he wants to do this, but he also seems very business-focused. Like, he wants to, like, he sees the whole Santa Claus job as being his ultimate chance at the job that he's always wanted in, like, the corporate world. But they're really, really trying to play up this whole, oh, he's actually doing it for his dead wife and his daughter thing. I don't know. It just everything about this just rings false. And like I said, we're just pushing through this because I started this 3 months ago and I have to finish it at this point. So that's the only reason this is happening. But like I said, I don't really know who's watching Santa Claus's videos in the middle of March, so I can just end this whenever. We don't need to be like them and continue to drag this out. I can just end this here, because there's not really anything else about this episode I have to say. There's not really some giant feeling of a lead into a climax here. It is... the horse is flying and the family went through the vortex, and now there's going to be a whole convergence of everything now, and I'm sure they're gonna teach Calpen the error of his ways, and his daughter's gonna say, oh, she doesn't need all this to be happy, and oh, Mom would be proud of him, and whatever the shit. All the obvious ways to end this. Oh, one thing I didn't mention was Jim O'Hare from Parks and Recreation played the Santa from the original movie. Not in the original movie, but in this episode. So, there it is. That was this episode. Who gives a fuck what happens next, but we're gonna find out anyway, I guess. So, I guess I'll go do that. So until then, that's it.